All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble. And I think I'm Flint Dibble. And yeah, just make sure you put in the chat whether you can hear us or not. But I'm here with two good friends of the channel, Dr. Eleanor Scerri and Dr. Hugh Groucutt. And they both teach at the University of Malta. And we're going to talk about their really phenomenal Nature paper that just came out, and it's been rocking the news all over, about long-distance hunter-gatherer sea travel to Malta, which is just really cool. So if you guys want to say hi really quickly.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Sherry. I work at the University of Malta and the Max Planck Institute for Geoanthropology in Germany. And yeah, very pleased to be here today.
Good. And Hugh?
Yeah, hey, I'm Hugh Groucutt. So I'm a lecturer in Mediterranean prehistory at the University of Malta.
Fantastic. And so Hugh's actually from Wales, so we got to hang out recently when he was visiting family. And he also did a nice favor and shared with me some information on Malta before I went on Joe Rogan to debate Graham Hancock. So we got that connection. We can talk even a little bit about some of that evidence there, because this does not prove Graham Hancock right. So to get everybody caught up, there's this fantastic promo video that was put together to announce this news. We're just going to play a quick little clip from it. Here we go.
These discoveries add at least 1,000 years to the prehistory of the Maltese Islands. They also bring back into sharp focus the causes of megafaunal extinction on other Mediterranean islands during this time, and also lead us to ask what other connections may have existed across the Mesolithic world in the Mediterranean.
So, okay, absolutely stunning stuff. So people have been on Malta for 1,000 years before we thought. Dr. Scerri, do you want to tell us some about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real surprise discovery because, you know, as a Maltese person who did her first degree in Malta, we were obviously all taught that, you know, there were no hunter-gatherers in Malta and that small and remote Mediterranean islands were beyond the reach of people in the Mesolithic and the Paleolithic world. And so, you know, even back in the midst of time when I was doing my undergraduate degree, you know, I always planned to leave Malta to study hunter-gatherer archaeology abroad because, well, there are no hunter-gatherers in Malta. I never dreamt that I would come back and find them. So there's a certain poetry to this discovery. But yes, so the first farmers seem to have arrived on Malta around, let's say, about 7,400 to 7,500 years ago. And we thought that that was when Maltese prehistory began. And it's a fascinating prehistory, of course. First Neolithic farmers, and then that gives way to the temple builders. So really interesting prehistory, but now we've been able to lengthen it by at least 1,000 years. And I should say that the exciting part about that is not the 1,000 years in and of itself. It is because it takes Malta back into a much deeper time prehistory, and that is, of course, the prehistory of hunter-gatherers, which we were for the bulk of human prehistory.
Yeah, just to back up and give a little bit of context here. I mean, so this is a section from Gigantia, which obviously people recognize maybe from Ancient Apocalypse or other sort of things. It's a famous site, but you can see that there's sections which show that there's this large wall, but underneath it are Neolithic phases. And so those were the first kind of farmers that were settling the island, at least until previously thought as the first settlers there. And so this, in a sense, is saying, hey, people made this journey at least 1,000 years earlier, and it gives us a different phase to start thinking about what's going on in the Mediterranean, I suppose, really as a whole. Yeah. What about you, Hugh? What are your thoughts on what's so significant here?
Yeah, I mean, Malta is like a very small archipelago. You know, it's small, it's remote, but also it's quite a challenging environment. You know, it's semi-arid. It's like really hot in the summers. There's very little water. So, you know, why these people came here, how they survived. Like it's very exciting, you know, there's so many new questions. And also, I mean, you know, people have done a lot of research in Malta. Like Malta has the most UNESCO sites by area of any country in the world. People have done like lots and lots of research, but it just shows with like modern scientific methods and looking at different kinds of sites, you know, the amazing things that we can find.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. This was an image also that you'd shared with me, showing the kind of GIS of Malta from the Supreme Council of Heritage, showing all the different sites, and there's just so many different sites. But yeah, it shows that there's still more to find, which brings me to a question I wanted to ask. So my channel members and patrons get to ask questions in advance, and the very first one here I think is interesting. Were you two searching for hunter-gatherers, or how did you discover this site?
We were not searching for hunter-gatherers. Essentially, our story when I came across a lovely gentleman called Christopher Foyle, who was very interested in the prehistory of Malta and asked me if he could fund a small excavation looking in parts of Malta that had not been explored before. And as a result of that, we did a bit of a recce. I think it was back in 2017. And a couple of colleagues who are involved in our study actually, took us to Latnia. And the minute, we saw it, we thought, wow, this looks like the kind of place that the first people to arrive in Malta would have gone to. And, back then I thought that this is going to be like the first farmers, right? But the evidence of the first farmers in Malta is already like quite, I would say like sophisticated. It doesn't really speak to people who had just arrived. So I thought maybe they'd arrived a generation before or something like that. Maybe we could try to find some evidence of that first arrival, but certainly never expected to find hunter-gatherers. So this was a surprise. We started digging there and we found all the usual archaeology, and that was already in an we thought, okay, this is incredible. Every phase we know about. But I didn't realize it was going to go even further. And of course, as we were digging, obviously the older things are, the deeper they tend to be. We went through all the usual stuff. We got to, the first farmers, and then, the archaeology kept going. The pottery stopped. The animals were no longer domesticated, but they were clearly being cooked, stone tools, so we started to clock on that we may be onto something unexpected.
That's interesting. So basically, let's walk us through the site really quickly. So this is a cave. It's Latnia. Am I saying that right? Latnisha?
Yeah.
Latnia. Okay. And so it's obviously you guys have some beautiful pictures of it. But sort of looking at the profiles here, I guess the upper levels are occupied. That's Neolithic occupation, and it has domesticated plants and animals in them?
Yeah.
Okay. And then as you got lower, you were finding more stone tools, I guess, like this, and then also these kind of wild animals that you were finding.
Yeah. Which is a huge one as well, because these animals had gone extinct before the arrival of people.
Okay, so what kind of species do you have?
So the primary terrestrial animal is red deer, and Malta has an endemic red deer species. Well, it has actually probably 3 endemic red deer species. There are at least 3 size classes of deer that are known from Pleistocene levels from sites in Malta. And they have, particular features about them that speak to their endemism. First of all, they're all dwarf species of different sizes. There's a large dwarf, a medium-sized dwarf, and a really teeny tiny dwarf. And the really teeny tiny dwarf has these sort of special modified feet that almost make them a little bit like mountain goats. So we think that they were living on the scree slopes of around cliff and open environments. And so, it was clear that we were finding the remains of these animals, these endemic dwarf species. They weren't, mainland natural size red deer that were being, somehow being brought over. So that was the first indication where we thought, hello, aren't these animals supposed to have been long extinct back in the mists of time? And yet here they are with people. So how old is this stuff?
Yeah, so that's actually really interesting to have this extinct varieties of deer. Do you have all three of these dwarf species at the site?
We're still trying to confirm that with studies. There's definitely the really small one, and there's probably a larger one. But obviously, we have to rule out dimorphism and do a big comparative study to really confirm that. But we definitely have the dwarf species are there. And there's also other things like tortoises. There are foxes. Foxes also thought to have been gone long extinct. And generally speaking, a diversity of animals that we've never found in archaeological context before.
Huh. That's actually interesting. So many of these species, these fox and these deer, they're not found at any Neolithic sites at all. So they're already extinct by that period.
We don't know if they were extinct by then, but we certainly don't find them at the archaeological sites. And the farmers seem to have a drastically different diet.
That's absolutely fascinating, actually. So I see what you're saying about how this talks to potentially the extinction of larger fauna and things like that on islands. Certainly, I know I work on Crete, and I've talked with Hugh before about Tom Strasser's work on Crete, and sort of the idea that maybe there were people there at the same time as this extinct deer species there as well. So yeah, so there's some interesting comparisons.
It's actually really interesting because even in the like temple period and the Neolithic, most sites people had found deer remains, but they always had a kind of story, like they were imported from Sicily, but then every single site they kept finding deer. But because most of the major so-called temples were kind of emptied out like 200 years ago, it was hard to know exactly, which layers these things were from. So actually what we found is like supporting this picture which had been kind of gradually emerging, showing actually like these animals were continuing like way after humans arrived on these islands.
Huh. Okay, so what you're trying to say is actually maybe some of these deer in these other contexts might still be survivals from onwards as opposed to an importation.
Absolutely. I mean, even maybe through to like the Bronze Age, that like the extinction date of all of these animals is really unclear.
Huh.
But I think it does speak to the fact that these humans are arriving and they're not just kind of decimating the ecosystem, right? They're hunting, they're gathering, but we're perhaps seeing these hints that they're doing so in a kind of sustainable way, right? If they wanted to wipe out these deer, they could have done. I would guess. So it's just, it's in terms of how these humans like come to a new ecosystem and kind of change it. It's a really amazing story that we're just really starting to unpick.
That makes a lot of sense. So thinking through then some of this evidence of the cave itself, let's see. So how many you mentioned several dozen lithic tools from the Mesolithic layers, and then 100 or more faunal remains, if I'm remembering right.
Thousands of faunal remains.
Thousands of faunal remains. Okay. And so how are you sure then that these are not just people from farmers who said we're tired of farming, so let's go to this cave and live as hunter-gatherers? How are you sure about the time range for this?
Well, we have quite a sort of thought out, I guess, program of like dating. So what we did first of all is we collected charcoal, large bits of charcoal, not like micro charcoal, from different contexts that span the different phases of occupation that we interpreted from the site. And we also, where we could, we dated bone, but obviously collagen was a bit of an issue, collagen preservation. So we couldn't date like a lot of the bone, but we did get some bone dates. And we use this to create a Bayesian model that takes the stratigraphy into account. So it obviously knows that if a date comes from under another date, it can't be like too much younger. So, we use the model to try to work out what the major phase boundaries were, because that what interested us was really when does the Mesolithic start and end. And at the same time, we also dated a lot of marine gastropod shells, which we had to correct for marine reservoir effects. And we sort of dated those separately and used them separately as a way to sort of validate the in situ nature of the site, because they formed these tip lines where people were dumping them that were in situ. And what we found was the range of ages that we got from the marine shell matched everything that we were getting from the age model as well. And that basically suggests, using the sort of probabilities of the distribution, that Mesolithic started about 8,500 years ago and continued till about 7,800 years ago. But of course, it could have started as early as 900 and it could have ended as late as 7,500. But it does seem, they ended late enough that the first farmers, if they didn't meet the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, would have seen the refuse of their living. They would have known they were there.
Huh. That's fascinating. Just because your sound was breaking up when I was sharing images earlier, I just want to share some of the images from the article. This is some of the stratigraphy. And so thinking through about getting different dates from different layers is how they're putting together those age models, which look kind of like this. No need to walk through it. In a sense, what you're doing is you're taking a large number of charcoal samples and lining them up with stratigraphy, and then trying to see where they line up chronologically, and using statistics, fancy statistics, to do that. unless you feel confident explaining your fancy statistics in a clear way.
Yeah, it's a good summary. It's just basically, yes, looking at the dates, but not just taking them at face value, but considering the stratigraphy of the site to constrain the distribution of those dates, because there's always an error.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's been radiocarbon and other similar techniques done at later sites on Malta. So that also sort of shows, hey, this is definitely something different, because we have these comparisons to make.
Yeah.
And just to like flow on from that, I mean, I think, it's important to emphasize, like, we have so many dates. Like, this is one of the most well-dated trenches, like, in the world, I think. So, because we wanted to be really sure. So that's one thing. But also, so we dated the site itself, but also we wanted to understand the regional picture. So we did a kind of big modeling exercise where we took all available dates for the youngest Mesolithic and the oldest Neolithic in the kind of central Mediterranean. And the point is, like, the Neolithic moves from the Eastern Mediterranean westwards, right? It doesn't get into Italy until about 8,000 years ago. So the point is, like, at Ladnia, not only is there no evidence for like Neolithic behaviors, so domesticated plants and animals, but also it's too old to be Neolithic given the context, So it's like detailed site dating and then that regional story that both gave this very kind of clean narrative.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, and especially with the finds. And I mean, what about your stone tools? Do they match kind of what you'd expect from Mesolithic in the mainland or in Sicily or elsewhere?
Actually, no. So it's really it's kind of interesting part of the story. The minimizing because the sound goes weird when the pictures are.
Yeah.
So what's kind of really interesting is these Mesolithic people, so these final hunter-gatherers of the Mediterranean in the Maghreb, so North Africa and in Italy, they're making like super advanced stone tools, like as advanced as you can do, basically. So, pressure flaked micro blades, and then making very particular forms of what we call microlith. So these are kind of like razor blades, so shaped inserts into like a hafted tool. In Malta, there's none of that. They're basically very simple. Like these stone tools wouldn't be out of place a million years ago, perhaps. They're very simple. So we're trying to understand, like, why is that? It's partly because there's not any good rock. So Malta is limestone, so there's no obsidian, there's almost no flint. So they're using this like very poor quality material. And we're trying to figure out, is that why, or are they using these tools for a particular function, or is it because they're a small population, they've kind of lost that cultural complexity? So yeah, we were surprised that they're not the tools we would expect, which is cool, I guess, but it's complicated.
They're not unexpected, because you do find similar stone tools in the undifferentiated or so-called undifferentiated Mesolithic of Sardinia, for example.
True, but like for example, we have almost no retouch, right? So retouch is where you take a sharp-edged flake and kind of do secondary flaking of the edges to shape a tool. We have basically we have one very simple retouch piece. but that also suggests like something about how the site is being used. Perhaps it's not, not in such a sustained way. But it's true, like in Sardinia, for example, Mesolithic tools there are also quite simple. So there is a bit of a story about these more remote islands having this simpler technology.
Yeah, and again, if we go back to the example on Crete, the Mesolithic there is it's from quartz and quartzite, and so with a couple imports of obsidian, and so by and large, while it is microlithic, it's not the fanciest examples of microliths in the Mesolithic, and that might have to do with materials or like you said, know-how. Because one of the big questions is you make this long journey and then you're maybe stuck there. So who knows what happens? Just to pull up and cite that article. This is the article we're talking about from Crete by Tom Strasser and others. So okay, so then let's think about that sort of headline thing. This is what's obviously been in the news and everybody is excited is, hey, it doesn't look that far from here, but I mean, we're talking 100 kilometers open sea to be able to get there from Sicily and even further from North Africa, right? So that's a kind of big deal to be able to do that at that time. So how are they doing this? How are people doing that?
Well, we know we have a long tradition of dugout canoes in Europe in the Mesolithic. So they are found in different locations. They tend to be better preserved in like Northern Europe. And also some of the very earliest Mediterranean Neolithic societies also have dugout canoes. And we're sort of sandwiched between the older dugout canoes and the younger dugout canoes. So it sort of seems like a reasonable hypothesis to go. And like, obviously we have no boat, but I think it's, it's fairly reasonable to suppose that these people were also using dugout canoes. And of course they would have had to row because as far as we know, this was a time before sails. Sails, I think the earliest sails are linked to like ancient Egypt. And sails, the big thing about sails is they require textiles. And we don't have textiles at this point. So a sail needs a textile because you need something that's very lightweight and solid that's going to be able to like move with the wind. And it's hard to see how you do that with skins or woven baskets or any of these things that people suggest in a sense. So while I'm obviously open to new evidence coming up, at the moment it very much looks like this was rowing. And if it's rowing, you're looking at people having to rest, having to take turns. Experimental archaeology did suggest a maximum speed of about 4 kilometers an hour. But, they did also change the entire crew halfway through the journey to have like fresh rowers. So, this is obviously not exactly what would have been the case back then. And you're crossing about 100 kilometers of open water because you're not probably leaving from the closest distance to Sicily and Malta, which boats didn't traditionally do in the past either, because the currents from that point take you eastwards and you'd have to battle against the currents to go to Malta. So even historically, boats prioritized departure from Sicily, from the Gulf of Gela, which is slightly to the west, and that the winds and the currents then take you to Malta. And that means a minimum distance of 100 kilometers. But of course, people don't row in straight lines, and there's all kinds of reasons why the journey may have been even longer. But I think the point is, like, experimental archaeology suggests that 50 kilometers is about the limit of what you can do in daylight hours. Mm-hmm. And so this, of course, would necessitate hours of darkness, and that speaks to knowledge of the stars, sea marks, wave patterns, all sorts of, a huge sophisticated corpus of knowledge that perhaps we didn't think Mesolithic hunter-gatherers had at this point.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Here's an artist's reconstruction maybe of the trip by Daniel Clark. And so, it's sort of, we definitely need to picture this. I mean, I'm a zooarchaeologist and, I study sheep and stuff like that. And certainly the genetics show that the first sheep to be domesticated were not very woolly. And certainly there's no sheep or flax or anything like this domesticated this far west at that time, even though there is in sort of, what is modern day Turkey and the Middle East and things like that. There's nothing like that in Europe at this point. So, there's no evidence for that kind of fabric existing anywhere nearby. So yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think this is something important we need to definitely not underestimate hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers were smart people just like us. And, you know, it's sort of why you fight with people online about sites like Göbekli Tepe. And it's like, they're not primitive hunter-gatherers. And it's like, hunter-gatherers didn't have to be primitive. You know, they could see the stars. They could work with the materials they had and learned how to survive and thrive, you know, in tough environments. So this is good evidence for that, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really staggering that they were able to accomplish this. I mean, I've been out on my canoe to the mouth of a bay on a flat, calm summer day, and it was still a little bit scary.
I've canoed down rivers in France where the current all of a sudden gets a little scary and you're turned sideways. So yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah. When I was 14, I capsized in a kayak by myself in Lake Malawi. It was pretty scary. I mean, I think the thing to emphasize is, like, from sea level in Sicily, you can't see Malta. You can from like high ground, but you know, these dugout canoes, they sit low in the water. You're heading off into a big sea, you know, with strong currents. It's pretty kind of mind-boggling,
And a
like,
very
why
small,
they would have done it.
Malta's a very
Yeah.
small target.
Yeah.
So let's think this through. So you can see Malta from Sicily. So clearly it was a target that people could see and were going towards, but there's all these dangerous currents in the area that make it a difficult trip, let's say, where you need to learn them, I guess, if you're going to make it or get really lucky.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
From high ground, but not sea level.
Okay.
And that's only
Okay.
on a clear day. So I've seen Sicily on a very clear day from high ground in Malta, but it's certainly not an everyday occurrence, and you certainly cannot see it at sea level.
Like,
Okay.
I've never seen Sicily from Malta. So, you know, and the other way around, Malta's much smaller. So it's like a speck in the distance, but when the, you know, the clouds and stuff are right, you can just about see. But it's really not like obvious or prominent.
No, and you know, to do this in dugout canoes, I mean, they would have been like quite large dugout canoes. So the sort of idea of ocean-going dugout canoes have been found at La Marmotta, these very early Neolithic canoes, and they're about 11 meters.
Yeah.
Which allows you to have enough rowers to accomplish the journey, to take it in turns, to store enough water, food, and in the case of the experimental archaeology, they also took obsidian with them.
Yeah, so you can bring some supplies. And I mean, you don't need a ton of food if it's about, what, a 20-hour trip. But yeah, you might need some water and to be able to rest.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's totally fascinating. So, all right. Another big question that I think is important to clear up is you can see there's all this lighter part to this map in your article, which suggests that that area might have been land at some point when it was much drier due to the Ice Age. So why do you all think that this is not the last remnants of, say, a Pleistocene or Ice Age hunter-gatherer population on the island?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's totally possible that there was an older population of Malta. It wasn't an unreasonable thought, because we know hunter-gatherers were on Sicily about 16,000 years ago. The oldest evidence that stands up to scrutiny, at least, is about 16,000 years old on Sicily. And, you know, 16,000 years ago, Malta was part of Sicily. So, okay, you know, that this is totally reasonable. But the land bridge with Sicily starts to disappear at about 14,000 years ago. So like roughly about 5,000 years before we find our Mesolithic hunter-gatherers on Malta. And from that point, Malta rapidly starts to shrink. And so we need to think a little bit about how a population could be sustained in isolation for 5,000 years on a shrinking landmass. So if we just look at the genetics of this problem, there are already like some important indications. So genetics suggests that to sort of maintain a population over time, you at least need to have an initial population of breeding adults of 50. So that's not the census population. Those are just the portions of the population that can reproduce. And among hunter-gatherers, the ratio of reproductive adults to the whole census population ranges between 1:5 and 1:10. And so that would be an estimate of 250 to 500 individuals as a minimum number, which, you know, is not really sustainable by any estimates for a land size that Malta had, even if it was like twice the size that it is today. And perhaps Hugh wants to shine in there. To me, it's virtually impossible that a population could have survived without an influx of new genes over a 5,000 year period. But Hugh, you can shine in there on the carrying capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, right? Of like how many people could have lived in somewhere like Malta, and it's very hard to say, right? It's very complicated. So there's kind of several ways we can think about it. So one is, you know, the kind of Lou Binford way, right? We look at modern hunter-gatherer societies around the world, see what kind of population densities they have, and then kind of extrapolate, right? There's problems with that in some ways, you know, like modern hunter-gatherer societies are not kind of unchanged relics of the past, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But even on face value, if you take the average population density from all of the ethnographically studied societies around the world, and apply that to Malta, it suggests there were about 10 people living in Malta, right? Like a tiny, because Malta's so small. So 10 hunter-gatherers is not a sustainable population size. But, you know, there's other ways we can think about population size. So like genetic data, but that's complicated in other ways. We can do things like, you know, counting the number of archaeological sites by different ages. But again, there's lots of kind of biases. But I think, you know, if we play with the kind of carrying capacity a bit. So carrying capacity is like how many people a kind of given area of land with a kind of particular subsistence basis can support, right? I think Malta, certainly we're talking a few dozen people. If we're like really charitable, a few hundred at most. But the thing is, like, you know, Malta, the ecology is very kind of like limited diversity. And we know from elsewhere where there's like not so many types of animals, for example, that impacts population size. So there's something we're still, you know, working on. But I think certainly Malta almost certainly had a tiny population that couldn't have supported people for thousands of years if there was this land bridge earlier. And then even if there was a land bridge, like Sicily to Italy, that's another sea crossing, right? And as far as we know, that was only ever connected once, about 20,000 years ago. So it's like, you know, these chains of islands and mainlands, how they connect is complicated, let alone what happens when people kind of get to these islands.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I mean, certainly looking at your faunal evidence, most of it is terrestrial, and the material that is from the sea, which you could think could help supplement and augment what's available terrestrially. Because if they're able to go not sailing, if they're able to go canoeing, they can go maybe catch fish for, you know, larger fish. But you don't really have any larger fish at the site. You mostly have really tiny shellfish, in a sense, right? Snails and things like that.
There are some larger fish like grouper, which do require sort of open water fishing. But I think, you know, one point to make is if we look at the fauna, if we look at the deer, they are severely inbred deer. We can see this skeletally, and we're also, you know, working on some of the genetics of the deer as well. So, you know, if there was some big free-for-all connection with the mainland, then you would expect to see some degree of faunal turnover. And that is not reflected in the terrestrial animals. And I think, you know, we have to take that into consideration as well if we're thinking of, you know, humans being isolated for 5,000 years on an island where the deer are not doing very well out of that. You know, there may have been some small turnover, but, you know, they are severely inbred.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense too. And I mean, if you're going to have deer populations that are severely inbred over thousands of years, you'd certainly expect the same from human populations, which are trying to survive on top of that, which would very much limit that. Yeah. Hugh,
I mean,
Yeah.
there are, you know, for example, there are fish. So we do have things like grouper, which is quite a big fish, right? So, and there are like, we're talking about thousands of edible marine shells. So it is like a persistent part of the diet. And we have, you know, things like whale bones and dolphin bones. But this then like links into for example, in Sicily, there's been similar debates. The late Mesolithic, they get a lot of seafood, but then, is that, for example, are they finding stuff washed up on beaches, or are they going out? Whales get like naturally beached sometimes, for example. But I think what we found does show a kind of persistent use of like seafood, which is very different from younger sites. So like Neolithic, Bronze Age, and so on in Malta, there's almost no seafood, which is strange in a Mediterranean island. So I think, as Eddie's postdoc Mario put it, this is like a surf and turf diet. It's really kind of bringing both.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me in some ways, I mean, in Greece as well, once you hit the Neolithic, you start getting much fewer marine remains. But like you think about the Mesolithic at Frankly Cave, and there's that, intensive tuna fishing. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, that's seasonal. It's not all year round, but still it's something that the hunter-gatherers knew to exploit. So are you hypothesizing maybe that these groups of people went back and forth between Sicily and Malta? Or do you think the evidence that you have with the crappy stone tools and whatnot suggests that a population was stranded for a short period of time? Or you're not sure?
I mean, we can't be absolutely sure, but it does look like, they were there for centuries and that they were coming back to the same spot to do the same things for several centuries. But we do see what looks like an intensification through time of that human presence. So, perhaps these are people who are coming and going during the sailing season. I think, we get enough DNA. Maybe we'll be able to shed more light on that and see if there's differences in ancestry or different connections going on, because the DNA of Mesolithic Sicilians has been to some extent documented.
Also, we're also doing like things like isotope studies, right, to try and figure out like the seasonality of site use. Because somewhere like Malta, like in the winter, the sea is super rough. Like you're not sailing in the winter in a dugout canoe. So we're trying to figure out using isotopes, are these like occupations kind of year round, or are they seasonal? And I think when we have those results, that will help contextualize like what kind of occupations we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. On that note, I had a question from a patron. That was a human bone was found there. Was it possible to carbon date it? And if not, how did you actually date it? And is this what you're talking about? My own question, when you're talking about doing DNA.
We did find some human remains last season. So this was like after the paper.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll find more. Most of the DNA we have is sedimentary DNA, actually, and that's still being worked on. So we don't know what that's going to tell us at this point. We know there's ancient DNA in the sediments, but we don't know which ancient people it came from at this point. And sedimentary DNA does move around. So you can't assume because it's deep in the sequence that it's, a Mesolithic person rather than it could be a Bronze Age person for all we know. We have to wait and see what the results come out as and how it compares to, for example, Mesolithic DNA from Sicily.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Do you have any other leads on where else there could? Do you have a model or thoughts on where to look for other Mesolithic occupation on the island?
We don't have any immediate plans to do so because there's so much to excavate at Latnia.
Okay.
I think it's such an extraordinary site. I think would be challenged to find a better place to look. And obviously there's a lot of construction in Malta. It's a very urbanized place, and a lot of caves have been emptied, in the past or built on. Even in the recent part, people would move sediments to create height so they could store their goats and their sheep in caves. So, there's been a lot of sediment movement. So I think it would be challenging at this point to find anything as good as Latnia, which I think is a phenomenal site. So yeah, I think we're just going to the plan is to keep working there.
Okay, that makes sense. And so what are your guys' big picture thoughts then on what this means for the Mesolithic in this region?
I mean, there are so many thoughts, what other connections existed in the Mesolithic world? How far were these people going? What was the limit of their movement? What maritime technology did they have that we could be missing? how many islands did they get to? How did they impact those ecosystems? And, was the spread of the Neolithic along the coastline facilitated by the adoption of Mesolithic seafaring technology? Maybe like not the other way around.
Yeah, so what's going on nearby in terms of the relationship between Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and the Neolithic farmers that are moving in? Do they mesh? Or what? Is there any evidence for how they might interact with each other?
Hugh, do you want to?
Yeah. So obviously, this question of how these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers interacted with Neolithic groups is like a classic archaeology question. And we don't really, obviously, we don't know yet in Malta, but what's really interesting in Sicily, for example, there's like very good ancient DNA. And in Sicily, the early Neolithic is about, people are about 92% like incoming, Southwest Asian DNA farmers, but they're also about 8% Mesolithic hunter-gatherer. So there's, biologically a small but significant contribution, and they're mixing. But what's like in a way even more interesting is that hunter-gatherer proportion actually increases through time. So the middle Neolithic, people are actually more hunter-gatherer genetically than the early Neolithic. So are these hunter-gatherers kind of, in the mountains, or somehow the populations are kind of separate, so it's super interesting. And what the evidence from Sicily shows is this like complex picture, I think, where farming comes and there's, cross exchange. And I guess that will probably be similar in Malta. But I think what the Mediterranean as a whole shows is that there's a different kind of story of the Neolithic spread in different places, right? So, maybe there were some places that were more like Mesolithic strongholds, whereas some areas seem to be empty when farmers arrive. So it's a really interesting topic.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, no, I agree. That's a really complex topic everywhere, is to understand this relationship between farmers and hunter-gatherers. And God, it takes so much work and so much different proxies of evidence to be able to start thinking about that in prehistory, if you see what I mean. Yeah. Okay. So what about, all right, look, we get these people online. We just seen some of them in the chat that are like, they want to believe that there's something earlier, an ice age mega civilization, and maybe they built these temples on Malta. And now all of a sudden, it looks like things are getting older on Malta, which is Graham Hancock's catchphrase, things keep getting older. So could this in any way be used? How would you say to people in a reasonable fashion, this is not in any way related to the construction of these temples? How would you demonstrate that to people?
I mean, they're separated by millennia, and the DNA of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and farmers is totally different. That's been shown in like very different studies. They're completely different people. But I think, an important point to make is, the idea that scientists are hiding information about an older Malta is obviously not true, because the minute we got good information for it, we published it. If I find some extraordinary discoveries, I'm definitely not going to keep them to myself. So
you're going to come on this channel and share them with the world.
Yeah. So, we're going to keep digging, and we're going to keep trying to find out more about the Mesolithic world, and we're going to keep going down. So, time will tell what else we manage to find there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hugh, how would you tell people this is not related to these temples?
Yeah, I think, the key point is not only is there thousands of years between them, but actually there's a lot happens in that time, right? So about 7,500 years ago, the first farmers turn up, but after a few centuries, they seem to disappear, leave, and then there's like 1,000 years when there's no evidence for humans in Malta. It's called the fifth millennium hiatus, and then about 3,800 BC, bang, there's another big wave of people, temples, new pottery. It's just not and that's why Malta's so interesting, because it's not a continuous, it's too small. So, throughout the past, people come, there's a kind of, effervescence, and then there's a kind of collapse, crisis, extinction, perhaps. So there's just no evidence for continuity. It's just different stories, same geography, but different stories.
Yeah, and sometimes certainly on the same sites, you get these kind of profiles where you can see earlier phases under later phases, and we saw that at Latnia. So, all right, what's going on? Why are farmers using this site in this cave in the Neolithic period? What are you finding in those layers? You're muted, Ellie.
Sorry, it's a multi-period site, and it's a place people have always gone to, and it's not hard to see why when you visit it. It's this cathedral-like dough line. It's beautiful, inspiring place to be in. It feels like a special place, and I think that sort of sense of awe was probably something that ancient people felt as well. So we're in the process of investigating, obviously not just the Mesolithic, but the entire sort of sequence at the cave. There is temple period pottery there, and there may possibly be structures, but we're not sure yet.
Okay.
They're obviously at a completely different level to anything that we find from the Mesolithic. Is much, much deeper. But yes, it is a multi-period site. There's Punic remains, there's like Romans, there's everything going on there. I would also really be interested to find out if we can find any Islamic archaeology there, for example, because that period of Maltese prehistory is very poorly understood. So I think, it's a site that's going to be a classic site. It's going to keep on giving. It's absolutely vast, and we're just digging in a 5 by 5 meter trench, and only part of that trench is down to the Mesolithic. So there's a lot that we'll be able to say about the site in the future. I think this is many decades of work and student dissertations ahead.
I think it's also, just to like paint a picture of this site, right? Malta is very windy and often, very hot, or when it rains, it really rains, and this area in like northern Malta is kind of garrigue, right? So it's a bare limestone with small kind of shrubs. It's a tough landscape. And then there's this one massive hole in the ground that gives amazing kind of shelter and protection. So I think just throughout the past, people went there for shelter, right? So, it's just throughout time, it's a nice place to shelter from the sun, from the wind, from the rain. So it's just like, yeah, through time, how humans use the same place, but in different kind of societies. That's what's really exciting about it. And I think, just to return a bit to the story of the site. I mean, what's interesting is different areas of the site have this different archaeological record, but there's a lot of like luck in archaeology, really, So when we went to the site, we thought this one area looked promising. Both Eleanor and I have worked on like hunter-gatherer archaeology for 20 years. It looked promising, but Eleanor dug a small kind of test trench, and that found this completely unknown hunter-gatherer archaeology. If it had been somewhere else in the cave, we might not have found it, So I think that the combination of like thinking where to look, but also just like luck. There's a lot of luck in archaeology.
Yeah, but certainly don't underestimate that skill thing, because as Eleanor said, that her first thought was that region would be where you'd expect, based on the environment and the topography and things like that. Early occupation anyway. So while you got lucky, that was based off of your skill and your ability to understand the landscape and where to look. So I think that's important as well. Like I don't want to underestimate luck, but I don't want to overestimate it either, because then some journalist is going to watch this and say, archaeologists got lucky. They're still baffled though.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, what we mean about like things like luck. Like another example, Malta's a very dry country, and it just so happens that there's like a layer of clay in the middle of the geology that water can't flow through, so it creates aquifers. And that's it's just a coincidence that it so happens that this chunk of geology has this one clay layer in it, and this island raised up. Without that layer of clay, there would have been no water and probably no people. So, in that sense, that's kind of geological luck, perhaps,
Yeah, it makes that small island that much more habitable, if you see what I mean. Yeah. That's interesting. So what about, more on the story of the site? What are you thinking? Are you going to be expanding to more trenches? I guess this is the one trench that, have you finished with the trench that you have? This is that trench, I'm assuming. And
we have not
yeah.
finished. There is a lot
Okay.
left. There is a lot left to excavate in that trench. Obviously digging extremely slowly and extremely carefully. So it's going to take a few seasons to be done with that trench. And we actually don't know how deep the sediments go. And, you know, if they go really deep, you know, could we expect to find the remains of animals like Malta's famous pygmy elephants and hippos, and, you know, what else could be down there? Could be like a paleontological site down there as well, and that would be extremely interesting too.
Huh. Are you working with paleontologists as well then?
Yeah.
Okay. Huh. That's very cool.
And I think, again, just to kind of, you know, say a bit about the site, it's a very complex site in a way, right? Caves and rock shelters often are. So you know, the way we excavate is we, you know, we remove a single, what we call a context, like a sediment type, and then when it changes, so it changes color or it changes character, we call it a new context. We have over 300 of these different contexts, right? And every single one, we do photography, we draw, we do, you know, 3D recording. So it's a very slow process. So, you know, that one trench alone is like years and years of work left, but that level of resolution it gives us is amazing. So people often think of archaeology, you know, with pickaxes and shovels. It's not like that. It's really slow, patient work, you know, like it's so meticulous.
Yeah, my dad started excavating with pocket knives instead of trowels in
Right.
order to slow everybody down so you don't disturb stuff, so you can 3D map it properly. Are you guys still using trowels? Is that what you're saying?
A mix. We've
Okay.
got a little like dental tools and wooden things, you know.
Okay, yeah. Whenever you're near a bone, you move to like a
Exactly.
skewer stick. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very painstaking and slow. Here, let me get this other image up just to give people a sense of it. So if you're only working in this, so is your plan to stay just in this one trench? You're not going to open up a new one anytime soon?
I mean, this the trench, the excavations are part of like a larger program on Malta where we're, you know, doing other things like trying to reconstruct, you know, something like 200,000 years of temperature and rainfall. We're trying to ask a bunch of questions about the age of the Pleistocene fauna on Malta. So it's basically the entire project is seeking to understand that transition from pristine natural systems on the island to human-dominated landscape. So it's a huge expanse of time. A bunch of it doesn't include humans. So there's, you know, we're conducting activities like across the island, but this is obviously the flagship archaeological site that we're investigating.
Excellent. Yeah, so that's actually kind of interesting. You're treating, was that Binford? I can't remember who called islands. It was Renfrew, I think, who called islands a laboratory for archaeology. So you're basically trying to treat Malta as your own laboratory to be able to understand the transition from a pristine, non-anthropogenic landscape to different versions of human occupation over time and how it impacts the ecology and the environment. Yeah. That summarized it okay.
Good. Yeah.
Good abstract.
That's actually totally fascinating. And I mean, there's certainly other projects that are doing similar-ish stuff. There's, I mean, not exactly the same, obviously, but trying to look at small islands and human impact on them in the Aegean. I have a colleague, Alex Nodell, who does the Small Cycladic Island Project, and they're just going into dozens of tiny little islands to try to understand human impact over time. It's mostly survey, though. So yeah, so it's good to see this kind of attention right here. Is there anything that oh wait, we have a couple last questions from my members and patrons. By the way, if you sign up to become a channel member or on Patreon, you get to find out who I'm interviewing in advance and ask questions in advance, which they then have to answer. Okay, so actually, I guess we did discuss a bunch of these. We were discussing the kind of vessels that people were using. And this is obviously not Neanderthal. But do you see any difference in terms of their contact in the Neolithic period between Malta and Sicily, or maybe even North Africa, sort of regular back and forth voyages? Do you have evidence for the importation of materials, for example, or things like that?
Shall I answer? It's complicated. you know, unsurprisingly for archaeology. On the one hand, throughout prehistory, there were things being imported, so like obsidian, um, like things like flint from Sicily and Italy, like groundstone axes, but really not very much, you know, like really quite small amounts. So it's tricky to know what that means. You know, is that some kind of trade exchange, or is it something more accidental, more kind of episodic? And what's kind of perhaps particularly interesting is that in the early Neolithic, there's perhaps more evidence of obsidian and so on. And then in the late Neolithic, the Temple period, there seems to be like less of that evidence. So that's been debated, you know, was that a society deliberately kind of isolating itself and defining itself against others, or, you know, or what was going on? But it's hard to say. I mean, you know, take obsidian. There's like hundreds of obsidian tools found in Malta, but most of them are tiny little chips, you know.
Mhm.
So what I always kind of devil's advocate my students with is, could it be like once every 100 years a canoe washes up in a storm and it has, you know, a chunk of obsidian and a few axes, and that, you know, that valuable exotic material gets kind of passed down and used? It's tricky to say, but I think, yeah, and until the Bronze Age, my reading is that Malta is pretty isolated. Not completely, but pretty isolated. And with the Bronze Age, that changes because there's sails, and suddenly there's much more connection all across the Mediterranean.
Yeah, that's actually interesting because I mean, yeah, the obsidian sources are presumably aren't that far away off of Sicily at Lipari, right?
They're like
There's
300 kilometers. So there's
sure, yeah, I hear you, but I mean, you know, certainly Melian obsidian is traveling all over the Aegean in the Neolithic, and yes, it's certainly with the advent of sails in the early Bronze Age that you see much more activity. You know what Renfrew called what the age of connectivity. I forget what he called it, early Hellenic too. But you know, you start seeing this fluorescence with sails, but still you do see these kind of basic necessities moving around, and it isn't
yeah,
it's far, but it's not that far.
yeah,
If people are
no,
living there and they have to be able to have contacts across to be able to maintain their societies anyway, based off of your sort of catchment sizes and modeling, then you'd think that they might get some goods in there. But yeah, that's interesting. Sorry, I'm just musing out loud.
But I think by the time they're farmers, they can support much bigger populations, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, that's and again an interesting thing to try and like model population sizes at that point. But I think the Temple period people, they're doing some very clever, you know, water management, probably maintaining wild areas, you know, that they're very clever at their subsistence.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, but I think like places like Sardinia, there's like massive obsidian export, you know, and these long networks. Malta seems kind of at the periphery of this Mediterranean obsidian network, probably because it is, even in the Neolithic, it's remote. It's only
Hmm.
when sails come, which probably is in this area, the Bronze Age, it's only then that it becomes really connected, I would say.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, let me open up questions to the chat, and while we wait for some to come in, um, is there a question I should have asked you, or anything else you want to bring up that is really important?
I think we got it all. Yeah, I think we covered everything.
Okay.
Was it aliens?
Was it aliens? Yeah, was it aliens? I mean, like if you think about that, that stone tool made out of limestone, that's pretty uncommon elsewhere. That might take some alien technology, right?
If they were aliens, they might have done a better job of the stone tools for sure.
I don't think I noticed any clear bulbs of percussion there, you know?
It's pretty nasty material, but you know,
Yeah.
I think an interesting point is like there must be other sites in Malta from this period. They can't have just lived in this one place. So then, you know, why have we not found evidence in other sites? So I think, you know, like Eleanor said, most caves have been like repeatedly emptied out. So there's lots of caves in Malta, but most of them, they're like empty down to bedrock. But still, it's kind of weird, right? Like, it's odd that we haven't found more evidence. And I think partly that's because these limestone tools are quite hard to recognize. Um, But maybe now we will start to find other places these people were using as well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I mean, as you've done a lot of surveys. It's really tough to date stone tools, especially these kind of stone tools, just
Yeah.
from their shape and their style. So you
Yeah.
really need something in situ, in context. And if all those caves have been sort of cleared out, that really does create part of a problem.
Yeah.
Here, I see a question from earlier up. Isn't Malta also part volcanic, and so some parts are very fertile and green with rain off the hills? Or there's no volcanoes there?
Volcanic, it's all limestone.
Okay. So just no. Any final questions? Here we go. You're digging a 5 meter by trench with trowels and toothpicks. When are you getting at it with a bobcat and dynamite? It's a good question from Glenn. Glenn, I see you've been learning from me. He's a channel member. He's actually a smart guy. He's just being sarcastic. But there's this other guy who's, I guess, is from Malta. He mentioned he knows of a small cave tucked away on the top of a hill in Selmoon. Might be worth a look. Maybe.
I think I know what you mean. Yeah, exactly. I think we'll go and have another look. I think I went there a long time ago.
Okay. Let's not give away anything to anyone either, though.
Our secret alien site.
Someone
yeah.
also said, like, why has the site not been investigated before? I mean, I think, when archaeology really focuses on later time periods, sites like this don't get looked at because they're not seen as having a payload. This kind of dig needs a lot of resources. It's very expensive. We had to get a lot of funding to do this, and it's very difficult to find like this much funding to invest in an excavation like this. So obviously there are financial reasons that puts people off, but the people knew that there was archaeology at the site because it's on the surface. So pottery had been found. So we knew there was probably archaeology there. It's obviously archaeology everywhere. But we couldn't have guessed how important the site would turn out to be. And, speaking of luck, what was really lucky is that most of the Mesolithic horizon is sealed under rockfall, and that really preserved it.
Yeah. So if some of the cave collapse or something else.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I think, and just kind of, speaking to that as well, I think the problem is like people get sucked in by the big, obvious, exciting things like temples. So obviously there's these amazing things like temples. People were drawn to them. They didn't go and look at just kind of caves in remote areas. And I think this often applies. So the so-called cart ruts, right? There are many cart ruts also in places like Sicily, but people there, they have Greek temples and things like that. They don't look at little lines in the ground. So it's about archaeologists kind of looking beyond the obvious and being more kind of systematic and so on. A few people asked about Hadraim in the comments.
Yes, I was about to pull that up. Yeah,
exactly. So just briefly, the problem in Malta was that most of the major temples were excavated, quote unquote, like 200 years ago. So this is like British colonial governors and officers would hire like 100 people with shovels and wheelbarrows and basically completely emptied them, which is tragic. So actually, like somewhere like Hadraim, there's very little left to excavate. So there are smaller temples where it's possible to do more work, but all of the major temples were emptied, basically.
Yeah, though I imagine there might be places where you could dig underneath in certain areas. But
Yeah,
but to
exactly. Or
get that
small
phase,
fondages.
that height of the phase, I mean, that's a
Yeah.
big problem in Greece as well, where again, places like the Acropolis and whatnot were totally cleared, which is why, of course, given some of the controversies going on archaeology social media, this is why we don't excavate entirety of sites, so that we can leave material for future archaeologists with new methods and new questions to be able to excavate, because we've learned the hard way that when you clear an entire site, your future colleagues are going to hate you. And as well as future fans of archaeology who wish they could ask questions of these sites, but they can't. So that's obviously an issue. Oh, I have a question. So you in the article and the press releases and stuff like that, there was a lot of discussion about the currents on how to get to Malta. But what about the currents on the return journey? Are they just as complex, or is it easier, or is it more difficult? Yeah.
We're working on a paper about this essentially. So, you know, we are going to produce something about that sea journey. So, you know, I don't want to say too much because this is research that we're still trying to figure out. But the currents are different on the way back. I can say that as far as I understand. Whether they're harder, I don't yet know.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, you would expect them to be different, and so yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess two last things. One, people love your birds. Next time you should set up a separate webcam for them. And with this software, we can display it and let them chirp a little. Thank you, Brujo. And then two, I guess this relates also to that intro video. So you're talking about these different ecological impacts. Do you have any kind of head start, preliminary hypotheses that you're thinking about in terms of the ecological impacts of humans on the Maltese landscape? Probably for the Mesolithic, it's probably a little too early for you to answer, but what about for the Neolithic?
Well, first of all, Sid, Vince, and Alfie say thank you. They are my budgies. And they have a really cute little personalities, but sometimes they can be a little noisy. So sorry about that. Yeah. So what was the question again?
I was just wondering about evidence for extinctions or ecology.
Yeah, we're trying. That's the story we're trying to work out still, because we have to work out like when the animals like basically did go extinct. We're not really sure. You know, like a working hypothesis at the moment is that maybe the really teeny tiny species of deer may have lasted even into the Bronze Age and may have been not hunted to extinction, but maybe outcompeted by goats, for example, because they would have competed for the same niche. So these are some of the hypotheses we're exploring, but it's early days to answer that one yet.
I mean, in the end, the deer were driven to extinction, and then, you know, the earlier creatures like hippos and so on, we don't really know what happened to them. In terms of the Neolithic, there is a really interesting story. It seems there was a big project called Fraxus, and they did various like sediment cores around the Maltese Islands and looked at the pollen sequences. So this shows us what kind of plants were growing at different times. And what this shows in the Neolithic is that the kinds of plants don't really make a whole lot of sense. So you'll have like one sediment core will have very different plants from another. And it seems like possibly people were actually growing like plantations of large shrubs. So that, you know, there's stuff like lentisk pistachia. It's a big sort of woody shrub. And some of these sediment cores show like really, really high levels of pollen of this lentisk. So it may be that Neolithic people were kind of keeping some areas as like semi-wild kind of plantations for fuel and for grazing. So, you know, I think there's a lot that we can learn from this. You know, like the Temple period survived for like 1500 years on a small semi-arid island, when lots of Europe, you know, they were having like the Neolithic collapses and so on. So there's a whole story about like how to successfully and sustainably live in these islands, I think, that's just kind of starting to emerge.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's actually kind of interesting to think about those shrubby gardens, let's say, for forage and things like that. Yeah. I guess, all right, one last question. Sorry. One last question, if you're willing to. How do you map out your stratigraphy layers in 3D? I'm going to take a stab and point out this machine right here. This is a total station, and my dad was the very first person to shoot an immovable find with one. And so, yeah, so I grew up using these map out artifacts, and you can map out layers in 3D, but maybe you also do photogrammetry or other methods. I don't know.
Yeah, both.
Okay. Photogrammetry for everybody is you take photos of you uncover a layer of sediment, then you take photos from different angles, and the computer actually puts it together in 3D, actually with quite high resolution, down to like, you know, something a few millimeters or less than a centimeter. So yeah, that's how you'd map that kind of stuff out. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciated you taking the time to come and chat, and we've had a really good turnout. So people are really excited about this, and obviously people from Malta and people from all over the world. So I mean, I'm very excited to see what you figure out from your Malta as a laboratory for human ecology project. I think that's going to be really fascinating, and more obviously from this excavation as well. And then I guess we need to end with a little bit of fun. This song was made for me by this other YouTuber. He was making fun of my name. But
Hi, my name is Flint, and I'm an archaeologist.
Rhymes and riddles, tickle, tickle, giggles, squiggle, jiggle, fiddle.